The Justice Department released a new batch of documents in the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, including chilling new evidence that some viewers may find disturbing. This is a jailhouse letter, apparently written by a Jeffrey Epstein. It says J. Epstein, and it was sent to another infamous sex offender. That would be Larry Nassar. The letter appears to include a reference to President Trump. We should note President Trump is not accused of any criminal wrongdoing. And I just spoke to a survivor of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse, Haley Robeson, a short time ago. Here's what she said. And DOJ says some of these things are salacious and there's no truth behind it. That's the statement it just released. But what do you think about the mention of Trump in that letter and what it said?
We need to talk about something that just dropped, and it's going to make a lot of people extremely uncomfortable. The Department of Justice just released a massive new batch of documents related to the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, and what's in these files should be front page news everywhere. But I want to warn you right now, some of what I'm about to discuss is deeply disturbing. We're talking about evidence that involves powerful men, underage victims, and a system that appears to have protected certain individuals for decades. And at the center of much of this new evidence is Donald Trump.
I think it's very apparent in that specific letter that was just publicized from the Epstein files. I think it's very apparent that there are a group of men that enjoy the company of young women and children. And I think that letter emphasizes that he knew what was going on. And that complicity is enough for me to know you have no business being in the position of power.
Not as someone charged with crimes, we need to be clear about that, but as someone whose name keeps appearing in contexts that should make everyone demand answers. Before we get into the specifics of what was just released, I want you to understand something critical about how this information is being presented to the public. The Department of Justice didn't just dump these documents and let people draw their own conclusions. They went on offense immediately to defend Donald Trump. They released a statement specifically designed to frame how people should interpret anything negative they see about the president in these files. They said that some documents contain untrue and sensationalist claims made against Trump that were submitted to the FBI right before the 2020 election. And they emphasized that these claims are unfounded and false.
Strong words there from Haley Robeson. Let's go live now to CNN senior reporter Marshall Cohen join us here in the Situation Room. So walk us through that letter. What did it actually say, Marshall?
Yeah, Pam. So let's be really clear about what we know and what we don't know. We have actually been aware for a couple years that Epstein tried to send a letter, or maybe did send a letter, to Nassar from prison. That's been out there. We had never seen it before, and it apparently was in the drop today from the Justice Department. It was written to LN, Larry Nassar, on the envelope, and it was signed by J. Epstein. And it was postmarked just a couple days after Epstein's suicide. No conspiracy there. It's not too crazy to think that prison officials will need to look at stuff before it goes out in the mail. So it's dated just a few days after that suicide, and I will read for you what it said. And as you mentioned, Pam, it's kind of disturbing. This is the letter. Quote, "As you know by now, I have taken the short route home. Good luck. We shared one thing, our love and caring for young ladies and the hope that they'd reach their full potential. Our president also shares our love of..."
They even added that if these allegations had any credibility, they would have been weaponized against Trump already. Think about that for a second. The Justice Department, which is supposed to be an independent law enforcement agency, is actively running interference for the president before anyone even has a chance to review the evidence. They're telling you what to think before you see the material. They're framing the entire conversation to minimize anything that might reflect badly on Trump. And they're doing this while simultaneously releasing documents that contain deeply troubling information connecting Trump to Jeffrey Epstein and his operation. That level of coordination between law enforcement and political defense should alarm everyone, regardless of how you feel about Trump personally. Now let's get into what was actually released, because the details matter, and they paint a picture that the DOJ's defensive statement can't erase. The most shocking piece of evidence is a letter apparently written by Jeffrey Epstein himself, just days before he died by suicide in prison. This wasn't a letter to a lawyer or a family member. This was a letter written to Larry Nassar, the doctor who sexually abused hundreds of young gymnasts and is now serving what amounts to a life sentence. Think about that. A convicted sex offender writing to another convicted sex offender from prison. And what did Epstein choose to write about? Donald Trump. Let me read you exactly what this letter said because the words matter and they're chilling. Epstein wrote to Nassar, "As you know by now, I have taken the short route home. Good luck. We shared one thing, our love and caring for young ladies and the hope that they reach their full potential. Our president also shares our love of young nubile girls." Those are Jeffrey Epstein's words about Donald Trump. Not speculation from a victim, not an accusation from an investigator. This is what one sexual predator wrote to another sexual predator about the man who was president of the United States at the time. The letter continues with even more disturbing content. Epstein wrote, "When a young beauty walked by, he loved to grab snatch, whereas we ended up snatching grub in the mess halls of the system." He's directly referencing Trump's behavior around young women and comparing it to his own predatory actions. And he signed the letter saying life is unfair before adding his name. The implication is crystal clear. Epstein believed that he and Nassar were in prison for behavior that Trump also engaged in but got away with because of his wealth and power and position. Now, I need to be absolutely clear about something because the DOJ's statement and Trump defenders are going to hammer this point. Donald Trump has never been charged with any crimes related to Jeffrey Epstein. Law enforcement has not accused him of sexual wrongdoing in connection with the Epstein case. Those are facts. But here's what's also a fact. Jeffrey Epstein, who knew Trump personally for years, who socialized with him extensively, who ran in the same circles, believed that Trump shared his predatory interest in young girls. And he felt comfortable enough writing that down in a letter to another sex offender just before taking his own life. That's not nothing. That's not some random accusation from someone with an axe to grind. That's what Epstein actually thought about his relationship with Trump and their shared interests. And it corroborates other things we already knew. It corroborates Trump's own words on tape about Epstein being a terrific guy who likes beautiful women as much as he does, many of them on the younger side. It corroborates the creepy birthday message Trump wrote to Epstein that only came to light recently. It corroborates testimony from victims who've described seeing Trump at Epstein's properties. It fits a pattern that anyone being honest can see. A survivor of Epstein's abuse named Haley Robson was asked about this letter, and here's what she said. She pointed out that the letter makes it very apparent there was a group of men who enjoyed the company of young women and children. And she said that Epstein's knowledge of what was going on and his complicity is enough for her to know that Trump has no business being in a position of power. This is someone who actually survived Epstein's abuse, speaking directly about what this evidence means. And her perspective should carry weight because she lived through what these men did. But the letter isn't even the most legally significant thing that came out in this document dump. The DOJ also released information showing that federal prosecutors believe Donald Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously reported. And on at least 2 of those flights, there were women on board who would later become witnesses in the Ghislaine Maxwell case. Think about what that means. Trump was on Epstein's plane with people who were involved in or witnessed the criminal activity that Maxwell was eventually convicted of facilitating. Now, the flights in question happened in 1993 and 1996 before Epstein was charged with anything. But that timeline doesn't make this information less significant. It actually makes it more significant because it shows Trump was embedded in Epstein's world during the period when these crimes were actively happening. He wasn't just some casual acquaintance who showed up at a few parties. He was traveling on private jets with Epstein and with women who were part of the operation that would later be exposed as systematic sexual abuse of minors. A former federal prosecutor who worked on Watergate pointed out that this information means Trump could have been called as a witness in the Maxwell trial. The fact that he wasn't called doesn't mean the connection isn't important. It means prosecutors made a decision about whether bringing in the sitting or former president as a witness was worth the political firestorm it would create. That's a calculation about optics and resources, not about whether Trump actually had relevant information about what Epstein and Maxwell were doing. We also learned that there was a subpoena sent to Mar-a-Lago in October 2021, just weeks before the Maxwell trial began. The subpoena was redacted, so we don't know exactly what they were looking for, but we do know it requested employment records for someone. And we know that at least one of Epstein's victims, Virginia Giuffre, was recruited while working at Mar-a-Lago. She was there. Epstein and Maxwell found her there. They brought her into their operation from Trump's property. And she described being abused at both Mar-a-Lago and at Epstein's estates before she tragically died by suicide earlier this year. So federal prosecutors were subpoenaing records from Trump's property as part of their case against Maxwell. That's not speculation. That's documented fact from these newly released files. And it suggests that whatever was happening at Mar-a-Lago was relevant enough to the criminal case that prosecutors needed those records for trial. The DOJ can release all the defensive statements they want about unsubstantiated claims, but they can't explain away their own subpoena requesting records from Trump's property for an Epstein-related prosecution. There's also an email that came out from April 2011 showing correspondence between Epstein and Maxwell, where they reference Trump spending hours at Epstein's house with Virginia. Again, Virginia Giuffre said before her death that Trump didn't do anything wrong to her personally. But the fact remains that Trump was spending significant time at Epstein's properties with women who were being victimized there. He was in the environment where these crimes were happening. He was close enough to the operation that his presence was being documented in emails between the two people who ran it. All of this adds up to a picture that keeps getting clearer the more evidence comes out. Donald Trump was not a peripheral figure in Jeffrey Epstein's world. He was deeply embedded in it. He traveled on Epstein's planes with women who would later be witnesses in federal prosecutions. He spent hours at Epstein's properties with victims. He employed people at Mar-a-Lago who were recruited into Epstein's trafficking operation. And Epstein himself believed that Trump shared his predatory interest in young girls and felt comfortable writing that down in a letter to another convicted sex offender. Now, here's where this gets even more disturbing. Every time new evidence comes out connecting Trump to Epstein, Trump's defenders, and now the Justice Department itself, go into overdrive trying to minimize it. They emphasize that he's never been charged. They point out that some accusations might not be credible. They frame any negative information as politically motivated attacks. And all of that might be reasonable if we were talking about one or two questionable claims. But we're not. We're talking about an accumulating mountain of evidence from multiple sources over decades that all points in the same direction. We have Trump's own recorded words about Epstein. We have flight logs. We have witness testimony. We have emails documenting Trump's presence at Epstein's properties. We have victims who were recruited from Trump's properties. We have federal subpoenas for records from Mar-a-Lago. And now we have Jeffrey Epstein's own letter saying Trump shared his predatory interests. At what point does the pattern become impossible to dismiss? At what point do we acknowledge that maybe all this smoke indicates there's actually a fire? The Justice Department's defensive statement is particularly galling because it suggests that if Trump had done anything wrong, it would have come out already and been weaponized against him politically. But that's absurd. We just learned about the creepy birthday message to Epstein recently. We just learned about additional flights on Epstein's plane. We're still discovering new evidence years after Epstein's death. The idea that everything damaging would have already surfaced ignores how investigations work and how powerful people can suppress information for decades. Look at what happened with Harvey Weinstein. Everyone in Hollywood knew what he was doing for years. Dozens of women had been victimized, but it took decades before the full scope of his predatory behavior became public because he had wealth and power and connections that he used to intimidate victims and silence witnesses. The same thing happened with Jeffrey Epstein himself. He was arrested and given a sweetheart plea deal in the mid-2000s, but the full extent of his trafficking operation didn't become public until much later. Powerful predators don't get exposed immediately. They get protected until the walls finally close in. And that's what we're watching happen in real time with these document releases. The walls are closing in, more evidence keeps surfacing, more connections keep being documented, and the response from Trump's defenders and from the Justice Department is to try to preemptively discredit anything that might implicate him rather than to honestly investigate and follow the evidence wherever it leads. Think about how the DOJ framed their statement. They said claims against Trump are unfounded and false without specifying which claims they're talking about. They made a blanket assertion designed to cast doubt on everything in the documents rather than addressing specific pieces of evidence. That's not how objective law enforcement operates. That's how political operatives operate when they're trying to protect someone. And consider the timing of that statement. They released it simultaneously with the documents specifically to control the narrative before anyone could review the actual evidence. They wanted Trump is innocent and this is all fake to be the first thing people heard, not here are disturbing new documents connecting Trump to a convicted sex trafficker. That's media manipulation, that's propaganda, and it's coming directly from the Department of Justice, which is supposed to be independent and non-political. A former federal prosecutor made an important point about all of this. He said that as more evidence comes out in drips, we're learning that Trump knew more about what Epstein was doing than he's ever acknowledged. Trump has consistently claimed he had no idea Epstein was involved in anything illegal, that they were just casual acquaintances who occasionally crossed paths at social events. But that story becomes less credible with each new piece of evidence. If Trump spent hours at Epstein's house with victims, how could he not know something wrong was happening? If he traveled on Epstein's plane with women who were being trafficked, how could he be oblivious? If Epstein felt comfortable enough with their relationship to write in a letter that Trump shared his interest in young girls, how distant could they really have been? The idea that Trump was somehow completely unaware of what his close friend was doing strains credulity past the breaking point. And here's what really gets me about all of this. We're supposed to just accept that the President of the United States had an extensive relationship with one of the most notorious sex traffickers in modern history, that his property was used as a recruiting ground for victims, that he traveled on the private jet where abuse allegedly occurred, that the trafficker himself believed they shared predatory interests, and that none of this is worth serious investigation or concern because Trump hasn't been charged with a crime. That's an absurdly low bar. That's essentially saying that as long as you're rich and powerful enough to avoid prosecution, your conduct doesn't matter. Your associations don't matter. The pattern of evidence doesn't matter. Only a criminal conviction matters. And conveniently, the people with the power to bring charges are the same people now running interference and releasing statements defending Trump before anyone can examine the evidence. This is what corruption looks like in a modern democracy. It's not always bribery and bags of cash. Sometimes it's institutions that are supposed to provide oversight instead providing cover. It's law enforcement agencies that should be following evidence wherever it leads, instead preemptively declaring certain people off limits. It's prosecutors making calculations about who they can and can't touch based on political considerations rather than the strength of the evidence. The survivor who spoke about this new evidence said something profound. She said that Epstein's knowledge and complicity regarding Trump is enough for her to know he has no business in a position of power. She's not saying Trump should be in prison without a trial. She's saying that the documented relationship between Trump and Epstein, the evidence of Trump's presence in environments where abuse was happening, Epstein's own statements about Trump's predatory interests, all of that is disqualifying for someone seeking or holding public office. And she's right. We don't need a criminal conviction to make judgments about whether someone is fit for public office. We can look at patterns of behavior, associations, credible accusations, and circumstantial evidence and make informed decisions about who we trust with power. The standard for criminal prosecution is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But the standard for who should be president should be much higher than technically not convicted of a crime. If we found out that a CEO had extensive ties to a convicted fraud artist, had been present during meetings where fraudulent schemes were planned, had business partners who later went to prison for fraud, and was mentioned in a letter where the fraud artist said they shared similar methods, would we shrug and say, well, he was never charged, so it's fine? Of course not. We'd conclude that person's judgment and character were deeply compromised, even without a criminal conviction. But somehow, when it comes to political leaders, we're expected to pretend that documented associations with sex traffickers don't matter as long as charges haven't been filed. The document release also included evidence showing Mar-a-Lago's connection to the Epstein operation through Virginia Giuffre's recruitment there. This isn't ancient history or distant association. Trump's property was literally part of the infrastructure that enabled Epstein's crimes. A victim was working at Trump's club. Epstein and Maxwell came to Trump's club. They recruited her from Trump's club. She was then trafficked to various locations, including back to Mar-a-Lago, according to her testimony before her death. Trump's property wasn't just tangentially connected, it was functionally part of the operation. And when federal prosecutors were preparing the case against Maxwell, they felt the need to subpoena employment records from Mar-a-Lago. That tells you they believed there was relevant evidence there. They believed Trump's property held information material to a criminal prosecution of Epstein's co-conspirator. The DOJ can't dismiss that. They can't spin that away. Their own prosecutors demonstrated through their actions that Mar-a-Lago's role in this case was significant enough to require subpoenaing records. What makes all of this even more infuriating is that we know there's more evidence out there that hasn't been released. We know Michael Wolff claims to have seen photographs. We know the Epstein estate holds voluminous materials. We know there are hours of recorded interviews. And as we saw in the previous congressional hearing with Kash Patel, the FBI hasn't aggressively pursued all of that evidence. They haven't interviewed key witnesses. They haven't subpoenaed all available materials. They've done the minimum necessary to say they investigated while carefully avoiding any inquiries that might implicate powerful people. That's the real scandal here, not just what Trump might have done, but the systematic failure of our justice system to actually investigate it, the unwillingness to follow evidence when it leads to uncomfortable places, the prioritization of protecting the powerful over seeking truth and justice for victims. That's what survivors like Haley Robson are responding to when they express frustration. They see new evidence coming out, and they see the same institutions that failed to protect them the first time now working overtime to minimize and dismiss anything that might hold powerful people accountable. Jeffrey Epstein's letter to Larry Nassar is devastating not because it's definitive proof of criminal activity. It's devastating because it's a window into how these men viewed themselves and each other and the powerful people they associated with. Epstein genuinely believed that he, Nassar, and Trump all shared similar predatory interests. He believed they were all part of the same category of men who were attracted to young girls, and he expressed that belief explicitly in writing to another convicted predator. That's Jeffrey Epstein's assessment of Donald Trump based on years of personal association. That's what someone who knew Trump well and ran in his circles for decades actually thought about him. And it corroborates everything else we've seen. The public comments Trump made about Epstein, the documented presence at Epstein's properties, the connections through Mar-a-Lago, the flight logs. All of it points to a relationship that went far beyond casual acquaintance and into something much darker. The question every American should be asking is, why isn't this being investigated more aggressively? Why is the Justice Department releasing defensive statements instead of pursuing every lead? Why hasn't the FBI interviewed all potential witnesses? Why haven't they subpoenaed all materials from the Epstein estate? Why are we learning about new evidence years later through document dumps rather than through comprehensive investigations that were completed when Epstein first died? The answer is obvious. Because investigating thoroughly would mean confronting evidence that implicates powerful people, and our institutions have decided that's too politically dangerous. They'd rather leave questions unanswered than risk destabilizing the system by holding elite predators accountable. That's not justice. That's not the rule of law. That's institutionalized corruption masquerading as prudent discretion. And victims see it. Survivors see it. They watch new evidence emerge that confirms what they've been saying for years. They watch the Justice Department rush to defend powerful men instead of investigating them. They watch the FBI refuse to pursue obvious leads, and they're told that none of it matters because technically no charges have been filed, as if the absence of charges is evidence of innocence rather than evidence of a system that protects certain people from ever being charged no matter what they do. This document release should be a national scandal. It should be leading every newscast. It should be generating calls for comprehensive investigations and accountability. Instead, it'll probably get buried under other news cycles, while Trump's defenders claim it's all politically motivated lies and the Justice Department continues running interference. That's how powerful people get away with heinous conduct, not through some elaborate conspiracy, but through institutional inertia and elite protection, and a collective decision that some questions are better left unasked. But we can't let that happen. We have to keep talking about this. We have to keep pointing out the patterns. We have to keep demanding accountability even when the institutions refuse to provide it, because Jeffrey Epstein's victims deserve better. Virginia Giuffre deserved better before she died. And the American people deserve to know the full truth about what their president's relationship with a convicted sex trafficker actually entailed. Not spin, not defensive statements. The actual truth based on all available evidence pursued wherever it leads.